Hi there. I'm going to spend some time today talking you through one of the concepts that's going to occur pretty much every day that you're in this class, and that is the six themes according to which we analyze AP World History. I'm going to give you a quick overview of and a mnemonic for those six themes. I'm going to walk you through some examples of each of the themes from some civilizations and societies that we'll study during this course, and then I'm going to send you off and try and come up with some examples of those themes for any civilization or society that you're familiar with. First, the six themes, we remember them in AP World by the mnemonic pieces, and they are politics, innovations, the environment, culture, economics, and social organization. So let me go through those in order. Politics asks how societies govern themselves. In any society bigger than pretty much an extended family group, you start needing to formalize your mechanisms for making decisions as a group, for maintaining security, for keeping people in line, for establishing certain common norms of behavior, and all of the question about how we do that, all of that is wrapped up in the theme of politics. Second, innovation asks about new technologies, new inventions, new ideas, into the spheres of production and communication and the sphere of warfare. We ask about what new technologies emerge in different societies, about their effects in different societies, and about the ways in which those innovations spread from place to place. The third theme asks about humans' interactions with the environment, and it's important to remember that's a two-way street. In the 21st century, when we're talking about the environment, usually what we're talking about is ways in which humans have affected the environment, often negatively. But for most of human history, we also need to be really mindful of the constraints that the environment imposes on human activity and the ways in which humans have to respond to that. So that asks questions about things like geography and climate and natural resources. The environment theme also asks questions about why things happen where they happen. So questions about demography, for instance, who lives where, whether people live in cities or in rural areas, why people migrate from one place to another, and why that matters. Those all fall under that broad theme of human interactions with the environment. Theme number 4 is culture. That's really difficult to define, but the best way I can do it is that the theme of culture asks what people believe and how they express those beliefs. Most obviously, that comes up in the form of religion or belief systems, and that's a huge, huge topic in AP World History. But it also touches on art and architecture and literature and poetry and theater and music, all of which will pop up occasionally in this course. Number 5 is economic history. That theme asks what people produce, what they consume, how they determine who consumes it, and how they exchange it. Trade networks across regions especially are a huge, huge theme of this course. The economic theme also asks about labor systems. So we look at different systems of slavery and forced labor in different societies. We look at the way in which people are assigned to different jobs, whether that's by merit or by birth or by something in between. All those fall under the theme of economic history. Finally, we look at social organization, and I'm going to try and define this term a little bit more narrowly than what people usually mean when they talk about society. Pretty much all large-scale groups of humans arrange themselves into different groups, different identities. We sometimes define those groups by religion, sometimes by race, sometimes by ethnicity, sometimes by language, sometimes by gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that theme asks how a given society is organized into groups and how those groups relate to each other. So that's where we look at things like racism, we look at things like patriarchy, we look at other aspects of gender relations, we look at things like caste systems in some classes, and so on and so forth. Those are the six themes. Pieces is the way that we remember them. You will memorize these involuntarily, but I'd recommend getting started sooner rather than later. Now let's look at some examples. So, first examples come from politics, the first of which comes from China. Imperial China, long before this idea attains its currency in Europe and in the West, comes up with the idea that people who work in the civil service, doing day-to-day jobs of government administration, should be selected not on the basis of their birth status or their family relations, but rather on the basis of merit. And so they come up with something called the civil service examination, which to any 21st century American high school student will sound very much like standardized testing. The idea is that people in Imperial China who want to work in the civil service, which is a very high status position, study often for years on end, and then take these grueling examinations examinations, mostly covering their knowledge of the Confucian classics, and only the people who pass those exams, which in some cases is as few as 1 or 2% of test takers, can get jobs and promotions within the civil service. You can probably predict some of the issues with that, some of the ways in which it might not be as fair and meritocratic as it's supposed to be, based on your own thinking about, say, the SATs and AP exams, but we'll get to that when we get to Imperial China. A second question that we ask ourselves when we're thinking about political history is how states gain legitimacy, which is to say, how rulers justify to their people that they deserve to wield power, that they deserve to have higher status, that they deserve to be in charge. A classic solution to this problem is to say, well, God or the gods put me in charge. A modern solution to this problem is to say, well, you elected me to be in charge. But the Aztec Empire, the Mexica people, come up with a very different and somewhat gory solution, which is centered around the ritual of human sacrifice of prisoners of war. Aztec cosmology holds that there is an enduring cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, and that in order for the sun to continue moving across the sky every day, the rulers of the Aztec Empire need to be able to mediate between the gods and the people by participating in these very bloody, graphic public rituals of human sacrifice in order to give strength to the forces of good, to the forces of light, and to keep the world turning. And so that's part of the way that Aztec emperors get to legitimate their power, get to justify their political authority, is by saying, we are the people who maintain these rituals and literally keep the world spinning. To the theme of innovations, two inventions that I want to point out, some of which you might already be familiar with, one of which you probably aren't. The one that you've probably heard of is the steam engine, invented in England, and one of the key inventions that enables the Industrial Revolution, which transforms the world, by enabling humans on a large scale to generate energy not from human power or animal power, but rather from coal dug from the ground. The other one that is probably less familiar to you is, and that past AP World students can tell you I love spending too much time talking about, is the camel saddle. As you probably learned at some point in elementary school science, camels have a remarkable capacity to go without food and water for long periods of time, which means that if you want to get across, say, a large desert, then it's really advantageous to have a camel as opposed to some other domesticated animal. And so the development of these various technologies to saddle the camel so that you can keep a rider in place on its back and so that you can have the camel carry big quantities of stuff. All of those are going to be crucial to developing transportation and developing trade in areas like Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, where you want to be able to travel long periods of time without having to stop and water your animals a couple of times a day. The one that you're looking at is the North Arabian camel saddle, which sits the rider up on top of the hump. It's also superior for fighting because the rider can strike down at any enemy while also maintaining control of the camel. But this invention and others like it are going to facilitate the creation of these very long-distance trade networks across the Sahara Desert, across the Arabian Peninsula, and in some other places as well. And once Islam is founded, that religion is actually going to spread very rapidly across the Middle East and North Africa along those same trade routes that are made possible by the saddling of the camel. On the theme of environment, two more examples for you. One is a really basic discovery about kind of a fact of geography on the Indian Ocean specifically, which is that the monsoon winds blow in one direction for half the year, and then they change direction for the other half of the year. As soon as humans figure this out, what this means that if you are, say, a sea captain who is based in East Africa and wants to go do some trading back and forth in India, you can embark on your ship, you can go hang out in India until the winds change, and then you can travel back. This makes the Indian Ocean one of the geographically largest trading networks before in the age of sail, and it allows for the creation of not only a really economically integrated world that encompasses East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, Southeast Asia, but also for the spread of culture. And so things like the Swahili language, which incorporates a lot of Arabic loanwords, the spread of Islam and of Buddhism around the Indian Ocean basin, and lots of other features of the cultural history of the Indian Ocean world all owe their existence to this pretty basic environmental feature. The second the second example I want to talk about is that deals with the fact that the environment theme covers migrations and it covers epidemic diseases, the most famous example of which, present times excluded, is the Black Death of the mid to late 14th century, which afflicted, depending who you ask, upwards of half the population of Europe. The Black Death, it's a little bit fuzzy, but most likely spread when the Mongols invaded a city called Kaffa in Crimea. And the terrified inhabitants fled to Italy and brought with them not only the remnants of their stuff, but also a bunch of rats in the hold of ships, the ships they traveled in, which were infected with the bubonic plague, which then rapidly spread throughout Europe, which was just massive demographic and political and economic consequences. So those are two examples of the really broad category of environmental history. Thing number 4 is cultural history, which, as a reminder, asks what people believe and how they express it. One example of how people express what they believe is illustrated in the characteristic geometric patterns of Islamic art from the Islamic world. And the reason that we see these really distinctive and elaborate features of sort of shapes and patterns in a time when, say, in Western Europe, people are mostly depicting the human figure is because Islam strongly discourages the reproduction and art of the figure of the Prophet Muhammad and more generally of human figures. And this means that most art in the Muslim world takes the form of more abstract geometric shapes. And you can see this in the design of mosques around the world today, among many other things. That kind of mosaic art isn't necessarily an expression of faith itself, but it does reflect the influence of particular religious beliefs. The second example is the development of what you might have heard about already, which is the Santeria religion in Cuba. This is an example of a phenomenon that occurs over and over and over again in AP world history, which is something called syncretism, which means the blending of religious or cultural beliefs from different places, different times, different groups of people. Santeria, which is a really distinctive feature of religious life in Cuba, incorporates a bunch of different elements of culture which are not native to the location, some of which come from different religious and cultural practices of the Yoruba people in West Africa who were brought forcibly to Cuba through the slave trade, others of which come to Catholicism, which is brought to Cuba by the Spanish through colonization. And so through these kind of new religious practices and new cultural practices, you can see the evidence of human migration and of the ways in which political and economic and cultural history interact with each other. Theme number 5 is economic history. What do we make? What do we consume? How is it distributed? How do we work? One example that deals with labor systems, which are a persistent theme in this course, comes from the Inca Empire, which constructed this massive and truly impressive network of roads spanning this vast empire with particularly a really long north-south span. And the way that those roads are constructed in a sort of pre-power tools era requires a huge amount of human labor. And the way that the rulers of the Inca Empire recruit that vast amount of labor is through a practice known as the mita, in which villages or clans or groups that are conquered owe a debt of a certain amount of labor or goods to the Inca Empire each year. And that's the way that they recruit people to work on these massive public works projects. Second example is in the Mongol Empire, which stretches at its peak across vast areas of present-day Asia, is that Mongol rulers really actively sought to encourage trade. They didn't actually produce a ton of luxury goods themselves, but they managed to accumulate a whole bunch of different goods from far-flung corners of the world by practicing policies that were really favorable to merchants. What you're looking at on your screen is a safe conduct pass that was issued by officials of the Mongol Empire to privileged merchants, basically saying that if anybody tries to rob or injure the bearer of this pass, then they can consider themselves kind of fair game for prosecution by the Mongol state. So legal protections like this, and also the Mongols' willingness to pay exorbitant prices for luxury goods and to give other privileges to merchants, helped the Mongol Empire become not just an incredibly destructive force, but also a force for the integration of trade networks across a much longer distance than would have otherwise been possible. Final theme is social organization. How do we group ourselves? How do those groups relate to each other? Two examples for you here. The first one is the Haitian Revolution at the very beginning of the 19th century, in which a society that had been created based on the incredibly brutal system of slavery, which was both racialized and deeply, deeply economically exploitative. All of a sudden, in the Haitian Revolution, we see the most successful slave uprising in history, which results in the creation of a society that not only is economically and politically different, not only is suddenly independent from France, but is also the first Black governed society in the Americas post colonization. And in which there is a very clear inversion of the racial hierarchy. Among other things, early versions of the Haitian Constitution prohibit ownership of land by all but a very, very small number of white people. And so here we have a political transformation leading to this big transformation in racial hierarchies as well. The second example comes from Song Dynasty China, and it's the practice of foot binding, as you may have heard already, wrapping up the feet of young girls in order to constrain their growth, in order to express two things. One is an aesthetic preference for small feet, but the other, and more powerful, is a cultural or a social norm that the place of women in society is to not do physical labor, to kind of sit around the house all day because their ability to totter around on these tiny feet is incredibly limited. It's worth noting, too, that not only does foot binding tell us something about gender relations in Song China and in subsequent periods of Chinese history, it also tells us a lot about class relations, because in practice, foot binding is really only economically feasible for upper class women. There are many women who are, many families of lower class status need women to contribute labor, which is often really physically demanding in households that earn their living by, say, fishing or farming. And so foot binding is just inaccessible to those people. So that tells us something about not just gender relations, but also about socioeconomic hierarchy. Okay, those are the 6 themes of AP World History. The question that should probably be in your head is, what do you need to know this for? And I'll offer you 3 reasons. The first is basically because the College Board says so, and in particular, the College Board uses these themes in writing lots of prompts for questions, both multiple choice and open response, lots of which you'll see in this class as well. A really common sort of rookie error in this class is, say, to be asked a question about social organization and to accidentally answer it with evidence about, say, economic history. And so you need to be familiar with these pieces themes and with other ways of describing them, for like politics and governance are used interchangeably in this course, so that you can answer the question that's actually being asked and maximize your scores on exams. So if I give you an essay prompt that says something like, evaluate the extent to which interaction between Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans in the period 1450 to 1750 led to cultural change, you need to be able to identify cultural change as a really important word in that prompt and make sure that you're answering. So if I give you the prompt, if I give you a long essay that asks you something like this prompt that you see on your screen, you need to be able to identify the word cultural as a theme in this course and make sure that you're responding to that prompt with evidence about beliefs in their expression, rather than talking about, say, the introduction of new labor systems or the creation of these political relationships of colonial domination. The second reason it's useful to have a sense of these pieces themes is that one of the fundamental skills we practice in AP World History is comparing 2 different things, 2 different themes, 2 different events, 2 different societies, 2 different time periods. And when we're talking about things as big as we usually are in this course, it really helps to have some different categories of analysis so you can narrow things down and not just state random facts about civilization A and civilization B. Right? So if I were to ask you to, say, draw some comparisons between the Qing China and the Ottoman Empire, there's a bunch of different things you could say, not all of which would be a compelling argument. But one thing that you could do is to narrow down your argument to belief systems and politics, right? And make this argument in which you have one similarity about belief systems supporting political power, but also belief systems leading to differences between those 2 places in terms of their social organization. In other words, you can make tighter arguments and you can frankly just sound smarter if you use these categories to try and refine your argument. The third reason is that a lot of what is taught as history in kind of the conventional version of the American education system is really just political history, right? If you pick up an older history book, particularly one about sort of Western civilization, a huge part of it will be political history. It will be about laws, it'll be about rulers, it'll be about wars, and so on and so forth. And part of the reason that I try to use all 6 themes very consciously in this course is to make sure that when we are studying a society in the past, we're not just studying its famous and powerful people, we're also studying things that help us understand how ordinary people in that society lives. That's why we need to get into these other features like economic and social and cultural history in order to make sure that we're not misconceiving all history as political history. Your assignment from here is to take these examples that I've given you and try to do the same thing for a society or a civilization in a time period that's already familiar to you. My recommendation, unless you have some other historical example that immediately springs to mind that you're really comfortable with, is to pick the United States in the 21st century. Or if you want to get super specific, if you think you can do this for Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 21st century, then cool, go for it. But I would recommend picking the United States in the time that you live in, filling those 2 things in at the top of the chart. You see some blanks there. And then just coming up with one descriptive example from each category. So tell me one thing about the politics of the United States in the 21st century. Tell me one thing about the ways in which humans interact with the environment in 21st century United States, and just put those in those empty boxes in a sentence or so. In the document that's posted on Google Classroom, you can also scroll down to the 2nd page and see some more detailed question prompts for each of the 6 pieces themes if you're having trouble coming up with an example that fits into that category. Finally, to help you, just in case you need to see these examples in writing, and if you want a sense of the level of detail, if you go on Google Classroom, you'll find that I have filled out this chart with the 12 examples that I talked through in this video. So that's there to help you get a sense of just how much I want you to write this up, the answer being not a huge amount. Just know that all I want is 1 example per category. You don't have to do 2 like I did in this video. So please make sure that you get that done and turn it in on Google Classroom. And as always, shoot me an email or sign up for office hours if you have any questions.